Tonight, we are discussing the Venom film. Is it going to empower the character, or is he going to be choked to death on the black slime of studio incompetence? I, for one, can't wait to find out. Good evening. By now, anyone who cares probably knows that Sony, 2 months ago, announced the Venom film, a film about the SpiderMan villain Venom, that they plan to release in 2018. Now, with this announcement came a lot of good questions, such as, will it be part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe? Apparently the answer is no. Will Spider-Man be in it? No. Who will star and direct in the film? No one has any clue yet. But it will be released in 2018, and it will be produced by Sony, which are both very good causes for concern about this. And that brings us to the real question, the big question that I think needs to be asked about this is, will the film be any good? Now, as a very villain-oriented individual, Venom was actually my very favorite comic book character growing up. And if you're watching this video, I'm going to assume that you're familiar enough with the character so that I can skip the explanation about the Secret Wars, Spider-Man gaining his black costume, who Eddie Brock is, all the situation with that. If you do want that information, I'll actually link you to a video down below where you will be able to catch up on that. But what I'd actually like to discuss is my thoughts and theories on this film in particular. So, one potential strike against this film coming out good that I mentioned earlier is the date. October of 2018 is when it's set to be released, which, if you think about it, isn't that long of a time for a film, especially considering that we don't apparently even have a lead actor yet, a director yet, principal photography has not begun, none of the basic qualifications needed to make a movie. So, it kind of feels like they might be throwing this thing together, which is usually not a good sign. The other major potential problem based on the knowledge or information that we have right now about the film is that Sony is doing this. And their track record with this character, Spider-Man 3, is not great, and in fact, lately with the Spider-Man franchise has not been spectacular. In fact, there were some leaked emails from around the time that Amazing Spider-Man 2 was in production that indicate strongly that they really don't know what they're going to be doing with a lot of these films, including Venom. In fact, I think one of the emails literally said something like that. So, does this mean that there's no possibility that this film might turn out well? Well, not quite. You see, one good sign is that they plan to make this film rated R, which a lot of people seem to think is a very appropriate way to treat this character, and I happen to agree with that. The character is very dark by his nature, and not just because he's, literally a black, slimy alien parasite, but because the character is also essentially a villain in most of his incarnations. I mean, you could, I guess, maybe argue that some of them, Flash Thompson Agent Venom, isn't quite as bad, but don't go with that, Sony. Seriously, don't do the Agent Venom thing. I am very pro old school Eddie Brock Venom, and that's most likely the character that they're going to go with, or the version of the character they will, simply because that's the most recognizable version of that. So, and that brings me to another point, which is that they are also very likely to make this character dark because it has been stated that they're planning to do this as a action sci-fi horror film. And as a horror enthusiast, someone who likes the genre quite a lot, I'm very excited about that. I really hope that they do bring a kind of dark element to this that you wouldn't see in other rather superhero films. In fact, in a lot of ways, this should not look like a typical superhero film, in my opinion. They can't treat this character the same way they would Iron Man or something like that. Venom is kind of weird, kind of dark, kind of sinister in a lot of ways. I would actually be very happy, very satisfied if they went full villain protagonist, American Psycho with a symbiote sort of thing there. I doubt they're going to do that because that would probably be too dark, and it would polarize audiences. A lot of people don't like real villain protagonists like that, but I would be very happy about that. So, the question becomes then, how are they going to handle this character? Is this going to be some sort of dark, gritty, vengeful, sort of Dark Knight kind of version of Venom there? Is that what they're going to try to do? Basically, tough anti-hero? Are they going to make him kind of a sociopathic jerk, which I think would be very fitting for the Eddie Brock character, and very interesting to watch as a kind of superhero film like that, with the protagonist, the star, being, well, very villainous. I would love that. Or are they going to just make him Deadpool with a symbiote? Actually, I think the comics already did that. Yeah, if I remember correctly, they went back and decided that at some point before Spider-Man got the alien suit that Deadpool got it or something. I haven't actually read the comics in years. I'm an adult. I don't have time for comics. I'm too busy making video games and posting about horror films on Twitter. Wait. Oh god. My life! Okay. So, how will they handle this character then? I think that's a very good question, because they have to do this just right, and a lot of people have noted that dealing with a character like Venom will be very tricky to do, and I agree completely there. This is probably, or one of the first times where you actually have a character who is essentially considered a villain now starring in his own film. They kind of tried this with Suicide Squad, with limited results in the DC universe, obviously. But can Venom pull off his own film? A lot of people, and I've seen this over the years as a Venom fan, underestimate the character. They think that he's not interesting enough. What I often find, though, is that part of their complaint is that they don't understand why he's so cool. One of the complaints that Sam Raimi, director of Spider-Man 3, was reported to have about the character and why he claimed that he wouldn't do it originally. Sony eventually convinced him. And that was part of the problem with that, by the way. A lot of people give Topher Grace a hard time about that film, but honestly, I blame Sam Raimi for that, just on a little side rant there. And, of course, Sony didn't help with that by making him do it. The point is, there was a lot of issues there that had some problems. But I find that the reason that a lot of people may have that same complaint about Venom, that he's somehow not deep enough, especially the Eddie Brock version. He's too inhuman. In fact, that was Sam Raimi's complaint. He lacks humanity. But that's what makes him awesome. I mean, the character shouldn't have too much humanity. He's, half alien slime monster who inhabits a host, and half disturbed photojournalist who wasn't necessarily the most ethical or stable person even before he bonded with the alien that gave him superpowers and corrupted his mind a little bit. So I feel like this character should be handled as a villain and not particularly human. He doesn't need that human element depth. He's a monster, and that's interesting. Let's have a superhero film where you have a monster for the protagonist. Or maybe it's not even a superhero film. Maybe Sony's going to come up with something completely different that we haven't even thought of yet, and that would be interesting. I am actually open to that. But once again, they would have to handle it just right, and that's going to be very tricky there. Another interesting point is, who's Venom going to be up against in this film? Now, the obvious choice, and the one that everyone's looking at right now, is Carnage. I, for one, am hoping that Carnage is not in this first film. And here's why. It's not that I dislike the character. In fact, I like him a lot. When the issue of Amazing Spider-Man where he premiered and the comics came out, I remember as a kid, I loved that. I went right to the store and got that. It was the most awesome thing ever at that point. But I think if you did introduce Carnage in this first film, I think that would be a little too much. In fact, the best example I can think of the problem with that is Spider-Man 3, where you had 3 different villains there. Because when you have that many characters shoved into one roughly 2-hour movie, it becomes too much. You can't cover all of that. And if you have to introduce Venom, especially without Spider-Man, or, maybe with Spider-Man, it doesn't even matter. Venom's a complicated character enough. And then you also have to introduce Cletus Cassidy's Carnage over here on top of that. I don't think that'll do justice to either of them. I think it would be best if they waited until the second film, and that would give fans something to look forward to introduce Carnage, and start with something a little bit more mild for the first film, to really build up and give Venom as a character himself time to present himself in that first film. And in fact, if you look at, some of the best films, superhero and even horror, they tend to be slow burning at first. The first introduction one. Think of a film like Predator. That's a sci-fi action horror film. And you don't see the Predator at first. It has a very slow build-up there. Or even the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man with Tobey Maguire there. He doesn't don the suit and really get into it till after a certain length of time in the film there, and that works. And so I think we need some time to see Eddie Brock and know him and have him introduced to the suit, and you then let him do his thing. Now, what would his thing consist of, though? I have an idea about this. One possible way they could go with this, I'm thinking, is something like The Crow with Brandon Lee. Think about that for a moment. In that film, you have this dark, vengeful protagonist who goes around and, to a certain extent, almost gleefully dispatches these other bad guys there and uses his power against that, or against them, and for the most part, for a certain point of time in the movie, he actually has no problem with this. He's got superpowers, they don't, they're no match for him, and that's very enjoyable to watch. And having that kind of scenario with Venom, I think, would actually work very well. Just seeing him go around and brutally slaughter his enemies there could be a really interesting thing until he comes up against the big bad, as you see in The Crow. They're the main villain. And I think that kind of plot might work for a film like this. Once again, there is several ways they could go with this, but trying to make it too typical of a superhero film, trying to make him too much of an anti-hero. The Punisher, for example, is a character that goes around and acts as a vigilante and kills people. Even Deadpool, you could argue, does that. Well, not you could argue, he definitely does that, obviously. I think Venom needs to be even worse. I think he needs to be even more unstable, darker, more monstrous. I think he needs to be even closer to a villain, and I would really like to see that. I would like to see them take it to a new level of dark, basically. And so that's what I'm really hoping for with this film. Now, there is, of course, the other question of whether audiences will accept that or not. Do they want to see a character like that? How far can audiences be pushed in that before they're like, whoa, okay, this is a little, I can't empathize with this anymore. Personally, I love villainous characters. Something that gives me some hope about how this might be handled well is a short film, a fan film that was made about Venom called Truth in Journalism. It was released for free, and in fact, I'll actually put a link to that in the description there. The YouTube version has the sound turned off, so I'm actually going to put another site down there, but that features Eddie Brock as a very kind of off, dark, jerk, kind of bad guy, and I love the way it was handled there. It's actually one of the best depictions of Brock that I've ever seen. It doesn't feature much of Venom, but it doesn't really need to either. Now, of course, for a studio like Sony, for a big budget film like this, you know they're not going to handle it this way. This is too subtle, too indie. It's not actiony enough, but it does show what could be done if you handled it right, if you were to approach this in a way that was a little bit more innovative, a little bit less typical, and a little bit more menacing, and I really like that idea. Now, one of the other concerns that a lot of people have about this film is the fact that Sony has told us that SpiderMan isn't going to be in it. And this creates some problems, especially if you're going to go with the classic recognizable Venom, the one with the big white spider on his chest. Because, of course, if you know anything about the comics, the whole reason the character has that is because the costume, the living costume, belonged to Spider-Man before it got to Brock. So, if you don't have Spider-Man, then that makes the explanation for the form the suit takes a little bit awkward. Now, of course, there are other examples in the Marvel universe of these types of creatures, these symbiotes, that obviously aren't sporting the spider logo, and so you could just have the Venom symbiote, but without the Spider-Man reference there and still do that. And you could actually come up with a compelling plot. You wouldn't even have to have a recognizable character at all for it. You wouldn't have to have Eddie Brock or Flash Thompson or anyone you know, really. The suit could habit anyone. But then you kind of have to ask yourself, well, okay, what's the point of having the Venom IP if it's not that recognizable? Isn't that what fans are expecting? I'd say yes, and so going that way would be very tricky. I kind of doubt they're going to do that. So what's most likely to happen is that they're probably going to imply the presence of Spider-Man without him actually appearing on camera much. Or maybe they'll surprise us. Technically, Sony could put Spider-Man in there in theory. It could just mess up the continuity of the Marvel cinematic universe that they're currently working with. But who knows? Some people have speculated that they may be planning a surprise like that, and that could be very interesting. But I do think they probably will need the recognizable Spider-Man costume version of Venom to really pull this off and do justice to what the fans would want and what they would expect. It would be very kind of weird if they didn't do that. But I would love to know your guesses about how they're going to handle the character in this film. Do you think they're going to make Venom some kind of grizzled, angry, jaded anti-hero type of character? Will he be a selfish, homicidal journalist? Will he be just Deadpool in a different costume? Leave your guesses in the comments section, and come 2018, October of 2018, when the film is supposed to premiere, we can come back and take a look and see whether our guesses were right or not, and what actually happened with this. I think it'll be very interesting. I'd like to thank you, my delightfully symbiotic audience. If you did enjoy this video that I made for you, please subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. It would really help out a lot. And thank you for joining me in this discussion this evening about this interesting character and, in general, the state of the entertainment industry. Stay evil, and good night. Reason 37 why Venom is cool. Unusual use of plural first-person pronouns.